So the webinar is now live.
Okay, people are coming in.
So, so they couldn't come in. Okay. All right, that's all good. If you are coming in at this time, we welcome you to this space. This hour that we have, we will start shortly. But we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get logged on and get comfortable. It's going to be kind of a quick conversation. An hour goes really, really fast, but I think there's going to be a lot of great information here. So I'm going to go ahead and start since there's so much to share. For those that don't know me, that haven't been on our speaker series before, my name is Roberta McWoods. I'm a retired literacy specialist from the Kirkwood School District and currently the Master Mentor for Teachers of Color. And I welcome you to our 17th Kirkwood Educational Equity Speaker Series. The purpose of this is to provide a safe space for Kirkwood School District staff, students, and communities to have courageous conversations around systemic racism that affects Black, Indigenous, and students of color, with the objectives of increasing equity for Black and Brown students and closing opportunity gaps. It is our hope that participants become enlightened, inspired, and more self-aware as they work to improve the lives of all students through the enhancement of social, emotional, economic, civic, and educational outcomes. I'm now going to turn it over to Ramona Miller.
Good evening. I'm Ramona Miller. I am the principal of Kirkwood High School's Pioneer Pathways.
Sorry about that. Here we go. Sorry about that.
Tonight, I'm going to review our format and then just go over some of our community agreements and norms. So the format of tonight's presentation is we will have a presentation which will last approximately 40 minutes, and then we will have a period for us to have questions and answers. We do ask that as you attend our presentation that you listen for understanding, you allow yourself to experience discomfort, you expect and accept non-closure, you feel free to speak your truth, and that you stay engaged. I also wanted to share the visual that you have to the screen on the right, what great listeners actually do. And we're just going to look on that left side. So the first thing that you do is you ask questions that promote discovery and insight. This we know is a very hot topic, and so there's a lot to learn tonight. And so we know that by you allowing yourself to do these things, it will open up for that two-way dialogue. We ask that you have interactions that build self-esteem, that will create a safe environment where we will be openly able to discuss issues and differences. The third thing is that we will have a cooperative conversation. We want to make sure that the conversation, the feedback flows in both directions, and that we do allow ourselves to agree to disagree. Lastly, we hope that you will make suggestions that open up for alternative paths. This is an opportunity for us to learn and for us to share, and so that we hope that you will all be open to that. I will be monitoring the chat for questions from our audience tonight, and as time permits, we will ask those questions at the end of our presentation. At this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Shondambrose Phillips.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Shondambrose Phillips, and I am the Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in Kirkwood School District. As Ramona and Roberta said, we plan for this year, we contemplating actually discussing critical race theory, given the fact it's become such a buzzword, a distraction, and kind of a dog whistle from political parties. You see, when you think about critical race theory, we know that it is not a part of Kirkwood School District curriculum. In fact, the Missouri Department of Education and Secondary Education actually surveyed the state's roughly 550 K through 12 school districts and charter schools to see which one actually incorporated concepts of critical race theory into the classrooms. Of the 425 districts that responded, only one said that they work with CRT, and about 3 said that they include the New York Times 1619 project. So why, we wondered, are we giving so much energy around something that already we know we are not necessarily doing, and educators are tasked with so much? We wondered if by talking about CRT, we were allowing other people to control our narrative and adding legitimacy to this topic. However, 20 states, including Missouri, have introduced bills to ban critical race theory and discussions about racism in public schools, and 8 states have actually signed these bills into law. So if districts are not teaching CRT, then why are all of these laws we recently have seen proliferating across the nation? What are these bills actually trying to ban? We knew that we had to offer this KEESS presentation to the community, given there was so much fear and misunderstanding. There are attempts to actually co-opt this 40-year-old term, critical race theory, and wrongly equate or compare the district's efforts to diversity, equity, inclusion, social emotional learning, and our culturally responsive teaching and learning as synonymous. If you look at the Educational Equity Task Force statements, we state that number 1, we will learn from others. Number 3, we will engage our community to build shared ownership and responsibility for the success of all. And number 6, we will teach into an inclusive curriculum that represents and respects diverse cultures and promotes rigorous and relevant instruction for all. Many of the criticisms actually is around CRT is from the lens of curriculum. Kirkwood School District curriculum is board approved, and it involves a diverse group of stakeholders. And I feel I need to state again, we do not teach critical race theory. However, we do teach our students to be reflective and critical thinkers, which includes the ability to view experiences through their own lens and through the lens of others. You cannot teach the history of the United States without acknowledging that we have not fully met the aspirations of the concepts defined in our founding documents. You cannot teach American history, literature, music, or art without acknowledging the Black, Hispanic, Asian, LGBTQ, and other diverse experiences. And by failing to represent, to uplift, and to incorporate student cultural identities, histories, and their lived experiences, we inadvertently minimize and erase them as a part of the nation's bigger story. And lack of representation in curriculum is in fact structural and institutional racism. So many of our participants today might have heard of CRT, but they don't have a concept of what it is or what it really means. Professor Kenya Brumfield-Young of the Criminal Justice Program at St. Louis University School of Social Work will provide information on this theory and clarify how the concept is discussed in higher education. In this journey to connectedness through conversation, it is important to discuss and to distinguish how diversity, equity, and inclusion work in K-12 education differs from CRT. It is my honor and my privilege to introduce Professor, author, and advocate Kenya Brumfield-Young to discuss and lead us to this conversation about critical race theory.
Okay, thank you for having me. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here and to be able to join everyone this evening. So first, I'd like to begin by thanking Roberta Woods, McWoods, Ramona Miller, and Dr. Shondambrose Phillips for allowing me to join you and your community for this really important and what I hope to be informative conversation. So as mentioned, I am a professor in the Criminology and Criminal Justice Department at St. Louis University, as we look at this slide of Arizona State University, right? I remember first being introduced to critical race theory at Arizona State University. And I was in law school at the time in what was referred to as Armstrong Hall. And I have an affinity for this building, so I share it whenever I can. I was in a domestic violence class and I was taking, we were discussing how race and law and policy all came together to be able to affect current systems. I had been teaching critical theory for many, many years, but I had never quite heard of critical race theory or critical legal studies, and that was all very new to me. And so I leaned in, and I was fascinated by what I heard, because it was very new, and it was full of passion. So, but I wasn't exposed to it until I was in law school. So now that we're hearing it again, it's become one of the most hotly debated and I think most least understood concepts of the last year and a half. And I think even just the wording and the concept alone just sounds alarming, but it truly isn't. So in a nutshell, critical race theory, or critical race, we have to look at it from the root. It begins with a group of social theories called critical theory. And critical theories, it looks at how we look at society as a whole. I mean, it requires that we really kind of dig down there and look at our social fabric and say, what are the normal assumptions about one another and the way we govern, the way policies are made, and how do we really fully understand how all of this works? So Max Horkheimer, who's a German philosopher, he did social research for 19 years, and he developed this interdisciplinary approach that we refer to as critical theory. And his study, it looked at class and class struggle, and it took cultural analysis. But the thing he also did with all of these analyses is he employed empirical research. He says, we have all of these great things that we're looking at, but what do the numbers say? How does this all pan out in academic work? So critical theory itself looks at social forms and classes and how all of those are put together, in addition to adding empirical data. Law isn't the only study that uses critical theory. Critical theory is used by several: the psychology, geography, economics, anthropology, law. You know, sometimes even when we look at a court case or we think something is disfavorable because maybe someone with a lot of money is able to afford the best defense, and we think that might be the reason they're able to win. That's actually a form of critical theory because we're still looking at class. So stemming from critical theory is we had critical legal studies, which is also sometimes referred to as critical legal theory. And what's important is that out of this theory actually comes the sub-theory of critical race. So critical legal theory was developed by a group of legal scholars who just recently experienced things like the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. And what they didn't particularly care for is they weren't pleased with the social changes that were made outside of these big major social events. So they were extremely discouraged. So this idea of critical legal studies, it came out of them feeling that the law is not objective or apolitical the way they had studied, because during their training that they were taught that the law was colorblind and that it was neutral and it applied to everyone the same. But what they determined was that it was actually intertwined with social issues, and especially that the law had different inherent biases. And so within those biases, they looked and said, well, gosh, this has different hierarchies. And what this has the propensity to do is it reproduces its own political and economic power. So this process of analysis, again, was very different than the traditional law scholarship, where we had looked at the law through this lens of neutrality, and that no longer was the lens according to critical legal studies, because critical legal studies also supported or felt that the law supported the interest of those who created the law and favored groups who had the power to control the law and the privilege in society versus those who don't. So as we got into critical legal studies, which both intended ways of looking at the laws and policies and how they affected by class and social events and its long-term impact on society, we had critical race theory. Now, critical race theory also came about through critical legal studies, and likewise, it developed in a law school setting. But it looked at things in a different way. Critical race theory looked at issues as how they pertain to race and racism. It wanted to explain that laws they're supposed to be neutral or colorblind, but in a way that they are developed, that these policies that are adopted by institutions and structures are actually infused with forms of racism. And that institutions such as the criminal justice system or housing and labor markets or the healthcare system all have these racial biases that impact the original framing of these institutions and the long-term impact on society. As part of their theory, it's applied to academics in law that argue that race is also a social construct and it's developed by society, not biologically, and that racism is normalized as a part of our society, which leads to the creation of laws and policies that impact one race or over another. So it's not saying that a person or a group is actually race or racist. It's saying that these particular policies were not viewed with other people in mind and were race-based and were products of the people who actually made the laws. And the person who made the laws were the long-term benefactors, and those who came along them are still the long-term benefactors of those laws, unless some of those laws were inherently changed at the foundation. So the term itself, critical race theory, that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She was a professor at Columbia University and UCLA Law, and she's the founding director of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies at Columbia. From a theoretical perspective, however, as I mentioned, CRT just doesn't attribute, and this is where I think a lot of the conversation comes. CRT, again, does not attribute racism to a person or a group per se. The fact that we as Americans are so driven and close to our policies that when we say that American systems, there's a knee-jerk reaction that says, well, I am a part of the system, or this part of the system is related directly to me. So we take a personal affront when we say it's the American systems, because we as Americans feel like we are intertwined with those systems. So it's taken personally, and that's that's some of the pushback. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the whole idea of critical race theory, though, isn't new, and we talk about it being 40 years old or so, but truthfully, it goes back as far as sociologists like W.E.B. Du Bois and others who understood that racism within spaces can actually exist without racists. We say, how does that happen? If something is embedded in a foundation, it doesn't mean that those who work on top of it have to have racist ideology. What it does mean is that the foundation of that, what they're working on, does, and it's still being carried out and carried through those mechanisms. So although the term is credited to Dr. Crenshaw, the theory itself is attributed to Dr. Bell, and also defines in the concept of the conversion, that one of the major tenets of critical race theory is that Black people only achieved civil rights victories when white and Black interests met or converged. So that was referred to as the convergence theory, which was a major tenet when Dr. Bell delivered or constructed the critical race theory. So when we look at that in practice, we say, okay, so how does that kind of all fit together? Well, under critical race theory, okay, I got myself a little off here, my apologies. Let me realign. Okay, I am actually one ahead of myself, so I apologize. This is Mr. Bell, so I'm going to go ahead and proceed to the next slide. Okay, so when we're talking about interest conversion, as Bell would frame it, we would actually be looking at something like the Brown versus the Board of Education case. So with that, Bell figures that the only way that civil rights can move forward was also for Black people is also if right? People were benefactors. So that being the case, his theory was that Brown occurred not because integrating the schools was the right thing to do, but for Black people and African Americans, it fulfilled a promise to the Black GIs coming back from World War II, who fought that desegregation wouldn't be a practice, and it would desegregation would happen, and that their kids would be able to go to school wherever they wanted to go. So it avoided any type of disruption from Black GIs that were coming back from the war, and it also resulted in the desegregation of public schools. So that was where interests of Blacks were made by that particular decision. But according to Bell, whites also had an interest in that. And it still allowed some form of de jure segregation, or basically allowed for the states to decide how if they wanted to segregate the schools, because even under the ruling, different laws were made. They were able to segregate by how schools were financed, or they could draw districting lines and things like that to be able to determine how their school districts were set up. So it turned all of the power back over to the states. Again, under Bell, he said it also endured the United States to more underdeveloped countries because of the need at that time with with us being involved in the American Cold War, because we were in competition for those countries with the Soviet Union. So again, under Bell's theory, that's where another interest was served. And the last being that by initiating desegregation into the southern states, well, that segregation in the South was viewed as an economic barrier. And being viewed as an economic barrier, then it was financially beneficial to desegregate the schools in the South. So according to Bell, Brown versus the Board of Education was a situation where both groups actually had their needs met. And so therefore the civil rights of Blacks were advanced. That's under critical race theory. Now, if we actually look at the 4 tenets of critical race theory, the first is that race is actually a social construct. And that is that it's not biologically based. It's not based on our bones. It's not based on any of those things. That was adopted as a core tenet. And according to the Human Genome Project, the data exists that expels myths of biological racial differences. Some of those differences used to include things like the heads of Black people used to be smaller, or the cranial density was more. IQ was inherently lower, and all of these different things. The second was that the acknowledgement is that racism is a normal feature of society, and it's embedded in systems. It's there, it's in institutions like the legal system, and it replicates racial inequality because we're not changing the foundations. We keep building on and changing upper level policy, but it doesn't necessarily get down at the root. It also dismisses the idea that racist incidents are anomalies, but instead are indicators of structural and systemic racism. So the third tenet is that it rejects racist incidents as abnormalities or a product of a bad few or bad apples. So if we were to apply this to policing, we would say that instances of racial aggression were not just a few bad apples, but we would look back at the fact that policing started out of slave patrols, and that the foundation in and of itself was inherently biased. So that's how critical race theory would actually approach that. Under critical race theory, there's also that racism is codified into the law. It rejects the claims of meritocracy, that color blindness within policy, within laws, within structures are not colorblind like they're supposed to be. And the systemic nature of racism bears a majority of the responsibility for reproducing these inequalities. And the fourth tenet recognizes that the relevance of people every day lives to scholarship. And that's embracing actual lived experience of people, which includes things like storytelling and oral recounts, and acknowledging the experience in order to actually help shape history and historical accounts, while rejecting deficit-informed research that excludes the stories of people of color. So what we just took a look at, it was a lot, but that was the core of what CRT actually is. That is not what people are bringing into K through 12 education. We're not bringing in DE&I. Nobody is telling one child that they're supposed to be inferior, or that another child that they're oppressing other children. That's not the core of integrated or inclusive history models or mathematical models. What we're looking at is something more like the following. I chose some events from 1918 to 1931 to kind of give us an example. So we have it's a very simple timeline here. And we've got some real, some incidents like the stock market crash, flu epidemics, President Coolidge's inauguration, and when the Star Spangled Banner was adopted. I'm not going to go through all 9, but we have a set of 9 historical incidents between that period. So then what I did, because this is really what we're talking about doing, is adding people's histories to this. So what I did was then I looked at what we call to be Black history or African American history, and I added some there. So we went from a model of 9 events to a model that now has 18 events. And that was just by adding some time, like when women got the vote, and instances in Rosewood, Florida, or the establishment of Negro History Week, as it was initially called, when Charles Curtis served as the first Native American US vice president. So what we did is we added additional history into this model. And I said, well, let's add again. Well, let's add some contributions from our Latinx and our Latino and Latinas. And I had to stop, not because I was out of incidents, but because I was running out of room on the slide. So we went from 9 comprehensive events to having 20 within the same period, by not telling anyone that someone is worth less, or that someone is being being oppressed, or that someone is oppressing someone else, or someone should feel bad. What we're talking about is teaching incidents as they occur, and naming and being honest about those. We have the internet, and I'll talk about all that later, but we have access to these things. So to not integrate a historical model, I think that does a disservice. Now, we'll look at some proposed legislation that was here in Missouri last year. So our first one was banning the 1619 project altogether. Now, the 1619 project was that was done by the New York Times, and basically it listed events and accomplishments from it was a commemorative of the 400th year of the first enslaved American into the U.S. colonies. And then it also told the history from 1619 forward into major contributions of African Americans at that time. So the first bill that we had was 952 that would just ban this project altogether, ban from teaching any part of it or any use of it by anyone, anywhere, at any time. So the next proposed was introduced during a special session to ban the teaching of divisive concepts. Now, this one was a bit more concerning, because according to this, they're saying that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. First of all, no one was teaching that. That was not at all. And that people were different by virtues of their sex or their race or their age, or bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. And any individual should feel discomfort or guilt or anguish or any other form of psychological distress on account of their race or sex. That's a really big statement. First of all, education It's always been slightly uncomfortable. The learning process of knowing what we don't know is slightly uncomfortable. And that's how we process. That's largely been growth. This is not to psychologically damage children. It's not, again, it's not to tell children that they're terrible. It's not to tell people, that they come from terrible spaces. But what this says is that we can't even teach that any group bears any responsibility for any action committed in the past by any other members of the same race or sex. So we'll see how that would be impactful a little bit later. And then the last one was House Bill 141, which banned critical race theory altogether, which was any curriculum that identified people or entities or institutions as inherently, immutably, or systemically sexist, racist, biased, privileged, or oppressed. This has critical race theory completely confused with any form of maybe a DEI workshop or a historic position in DEI or anything like that. We under this law that it was not okay to define a person's identity. Under CRT, defining identities was not even, that's not even part of what CRT was. We do a lot of identity definition in things like DEI, but not under CRT. So that definition in and of itself, it shows that we don't quite have a handle on what CRT really is and what CRT teaches at graduate level, in college levels and things like that. It's not at the K through 12 level. So when I said we would see what this particular bill looked like, and that's just the base of one of the languages from the previous slide. But if we were able to go with what the legislation states, what we could not teach would be like the history of this particular slave who was a representative of slavery at Arlington. We also wouldn't be able to teach the Constitution. There's several things about the Constitution that we wouldn't be able to teach. One of them is we could not teach the 13th Amendment, and that it still allows for people to be enslaved if they have been convicted of a crime. Nor would it allow us to teach the 14th Amendment that exists because when slaves were freed, they were not considered to be citizens. So the 14th Amendment being introduced and ratified allowed for that citizenship to happen, and the children who were born out of some of born in the United States, again, were also to be allowed citizens. So that's kind of where the 14th Amendment came from. But under those particular definitions, under those legislations, we would not be able to teach about that. We also wouldn't be able to teach, I think a lot of us read the Diary of Anne Frank when we were going to school. That's another area that we would not have been able to teach or to read about, because we would not have been able to identify the Germans as being Aryan or doing any of those nomenclatures that we used during that time, nor because of some of the language in her diary. So this would be another element that we would not be able to teach. The true story of Thanksgiving. We also would not be able to have an open discussion about Thanksgiving and the events that occurred. We would not be able to talk about the relationships between the settlers and the American Indians that were here. So that would be a conversation that we couldn't have. Another conversation we couldn't have would be one about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We could talk about that he exists and that he was a reverend, but we could not go into detail as to the movement, as to how important the civil rights movement was and why that was supposed to be so impactful, because we would not be able to identify groups, or we would not be able to discuss the actual raw history in the way that we are discussing having these conversations. These aren't to assign guilt. It's to weave together that as a country, we are a fiber that comes from a myriad of different people that all have of experiences in this country. So ideally, when we taught, it would look a lot like this. We would have a hodgepodge of everyone and their stories being treated equally and being brought to the forefront. So while some people consider what as being brought as being revisionist history, what I was taught growing up, I think very much was revisionist history. I think what we're looking at now is telling history from an accurate perspective. And some may consider this legislation or legislation like it as a censorship of historic events. If we're starting to take things out so that we're not focusing on the entire picture and everyone involved. So if I've not said it enough, and I'm sure I have, CRT is not being taught in K through 12 schools. CRT is not diversity training. History and other subjects did not happen in a vacuum. People of all races, ethnicities, genders, and backgrounds contributed something to the history of the United States. So the objective is to not assign blame to children or to groups or to individuals. No one is going to tell people or tell their children that they are responsible for all of the ills of the world. But on the same token, those proposed discussions are also not to teach other children that they are inherently inferior. But what they are opportunities for young people to ask questions. And that even means asking hard questions from us adults, even things that we may not completely understand. And that's okay too. And it's also for them to develop a greater understanding of the country in which we live and in which they are going to one day choose to participate. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and I want to go ahead and turn this back over to the panel and for questions.
Wow. Very, very, very impressed. And I love the way that you, I think, and I hope everyone can agree with just a good explanation of some of the things that we've heard, some of the misinformation that we've heard. We've got a few things in the chat, and we are going to allow those questions to go through. However, we have some that we would also like to ask you, and hopefully some of our guests on here, participants, would like to hear some of those answers. So I'm going to pitch it to Dr. Shondambrose Phillips first.
Okay.
Okay, I think there was a question in the chat on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So specifically, what is that? And so I think I'll address that answer first, and then we'll go to some other questions that we have. And I want to put this in the most simplistic terms. I think oftentimes when we give definitions, we give these very elaborate and intellectual responses. And I just want to make sure that I'm putting it in a way that you can understand. So for me, diversity asks like, who's here and who isn't? Simply put, do you have a seat at the table? So you can consider any difference that could potentially make a difference. For example, thinking about ethnicity, gender, age, religion, disability, sexual orientation. I mean, you could go on, but just again, who's here and who isn't? I think what makes us diverse as individuals can make us really strong as a community or as an organization. And so looking for that difference and making sure you're addressing that. When I think about equity, for me, it refers to fairness. And so equity of our systems, equity of our structures. If we want equitable outcomes as a school district, it really requires that we have equitable operations. And so I talk about a lot about our policies, our practices, and our procedures. But for me, that's also the curriculum. That's the people and the spaces. And equity for me is an action word, like it's a verb. And so it's not just what we say, it's what we do. And our kids are watching that. And then for the inclusion piece, I think it's not just having people at that table, but do they really feel like they have a sense of belonging? Do our students, do our staff members, do our families, do they feel safe, whether it's physically or psychologically? You can actually have a seat at that table, but do you have a voice? And is your voice really heard? And is it valued? So for me, I think when you think about DEI, it's not a specific discrete event. It's a journey. It's something that we will continue on. But all of those things are really important. And I've said a lot here, the inclusion piece for me is it's really the most important, because I can bring people to a table and create a diverse picture. And I can put some things in place to say, oh, look, we're trying to advance equity, and it could be performative. But inclusion is what you really want, for people to actually feel a sense of belonging and feel valued in a system. And so hopefully that's a short answer to what it might be in a way that people can understand. So the next.
I'd like to ask Dr. Young a question that I know many parents that are probably on this session with us today, and parents that I've spoken to. There's been so much fear around it, and you spoke to that earlier in your presentation. What are some things that we could tell our parents to kind of ease, what actually is being taught? I know you said a lot of things, but what are some of the things that parents can walk away with tonight?
Well, I think one of the things that parents can walk away with is to be as engaged as possible in their children's education. See what they're learning, help with their homework, go to the PTA meetings, set up time with teachers to have conversations when they're parent-teacher conferences, one-on-ones. If a parent is engaging with the material, then they are absolutely aware of what's being taught, and it takes away the well, I think, because if they don't understand or they have a different thought about it, then they can ask the appropriate question at the appropriate time, versus maybe catching on the tail end of what other people may think is going on. And it's kind of like that meme, what I think it is, what my friend thinks it is, what I think it is, what it really is. And I think that those are some of the other things. The other things is to ask your kids, what do they think about what they're learning? What do they think about what their lessons? What are they learning? How are they feeling about it? How do you feel is a really big question. And to help process that with kids, because this whole thing has been it's become such a become such a political it's a driving force. It's very divisive in and of itself, and it's become hyper political, that I don't think that the people in the room that it affects the most are our kids. And so those are the people that we really need to be checking in with about this. And sometimes as adults, I think we project down and say, this is what I think it is. Ask the kids what they're getting out of it, and not plant what you think they're getting out of it. So it all forms around communication and engagement, and even understanding that not everybody works a schedule where they can do those things. So, emails or text or whatever form of communication that they can have, I would highly suggest do that.
Thank you. Great suggestions.
There's a question in the chat that actually kind of goes right along with that, and I'm looking at them. There are a couple that kind of are on the same level, but the question has to do with what are some available or some accessible resources that would help people better understand CRT and even be used to help others who have a less informed understanding of CRT. So resources that our parents and the community can have to have a better understanding, in addition to this presentation that is being recorded.
Kimberly Crenshaw actually does a lot of articles where they've done interviews. I think there's, and I know that this isn't a scholarly source, but I think there's one in Vogue, and there's several others where people have asked Kimberly Crenshaw these very questions. What is this? What does this mean? So the most accessible ones are to be able to go online and Google interviews and look for the writings from Derek Bell, and to read the interviews with Kimberly Crenshaw. These are the two people that actually put this theory together and know it better than anyone else. So from where I sit, it's like what it is what they say it is. And from where we've gone with it is we've added things to it and called it CRT, and that's not necessarily correct. So I would look for several of her interviews. Those are some places that I would go because you can read them anywhere, and they're very, very easy to read. They're very ingestible. So those are ones, that's where I would actually recommend starting.
Thank you.
Actually, I think I'm going to piggyback off of that point and pull another question that I'm seeing here. Why is there so much resistance to critical race theory? So once people are able to find out what it is, not only from the presentation tonight, but doing their additional research, where did all of this hysteria begin? Again, we talked about the fact that it's 40 years old, and you went back to say, even with W.E.B. Du Bois, that this has been around for a while. So why is it that recently we're seeing this uptick in conversation and hysteria about CRT? Is summing up the question.
So, and with all due respect, I keep pushing back on this because I don't think what we're seeing is a hysteria about true CRT. Okay, we've thrown some principles of DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equity and inclusion, and a lot of other things into this big basket and said, this is CRT.
Right.
And that's incorrect, okay? We've taken a lot of concepts that's thrown in the kitchen sink. So we've lumped everything together as critical race theory, the 1619 project, whiteness studies, talking about white privilege, DEI, all of this stuff is what we've put in a basket and said, this is CRT. That's not correct. So I think what we have is the pushback to the expansion of actually teaching the whole history. We have a hysteria about what people think CRT is, okay? Because back in 2019, when the New York Times introduced the 1619 project, immediately after we got the 1776 project, right, which was the counter project to 1619. And then a little further, like within a couple of months, I think it was an activist, Chris Rufo, was on Tucker Carlson on Fox News. And he said, and I'm quoting, he was declaring a one-man war against critical race theory in the federal government. And I'm not going to stop these investigations until we can abolish it within our public institutions. Oh my gosh, the groundswell. Okay, so that's when we got the federal ban, that came out of the last administration. We couldn't teach it anywhere federally. We couldn't do DEI work. They couldn't be, because all of this was lumped into critical race theory. And that's where the messaging started. We're teaching people to hate themselves. We're teaching, and then we had the incident with Coke and the leaked in and the, I forgot what the slide said, but it was something like, it was negative about being white. And so that was time to see, this is what they're teaching. That was again, so incorrect. And so that really fueled, though, that caught on. And everybody was like, what do you mean? No, we can't be teaching this because that's racist in and of itself. What we weren't teaching is we weren't able to get back in and say, no, what that is a lot of other stuff all wound together. Nobody's teaching CRT. What we're talking about is teaching history. So it was being able to reel the noise back in because it was, the hysteria was directly related to driving political forces, because defund the police was no longer a political driver. And so CRT really was. So they used the term CRT in order to be able to move some of that through. And what's interesting is the ideology behind banning what is being considered as CRT is the very foundation of what actual CRT is. It's basing policy on race. That's what CRT is, and that's what we're actually doing when we say we're not going to allow these things. So it's really a modern day exhibition of, we're not doing the CRT, but we're going to ban it because it talks about race. And so it's a circular thing. But the hysteria, that was where a lot of that came from.
Thank you
Wow.
for responding to that. And I just want to add another comment that Ramona and Roberta would both also remember when you talked about the timeline and when this happened. The three of us actually hosted with the Kirkwood Teachers of Color a peace walk in this district. And I don't know, Ramona, Roberta, to chime in. There's probably, I think I've heard 3,000 people. I've heard large numbers of individuals. It was so many people in this community that came out. It was a magical day. And we really wanted our community to continue to rally around Black lives, even after that day, after the march, stopped. And a lot of our parents and our racial equity groups and community members, and they really truly have. But what you saw in that movement in the wake of George Floyd's murder, it was this racial, awakening, if you will, where people were taking notice in things in ways that they had not previously done. And those communities of individuals who were making sure that they stood up and stated unequivocally, Black Lives Matter, were also our white allies and co-conspirators in this work. And then there was a shift because we stopped talking about that and moving towards racial equity, where you saw individuals putting out statements, and we started talking about CRT. And so I feel like it changed the narrative. And so essentially what you're saying was the intent was really what happened. Because like this, we're not, moving off of that momentum, and going forward, we're addressing critical race theory, which we're not teaching. And so there was a shift. So I don't know if you guys want to add anything, but I just want to, it took me back to that day, and, how just, how encouraged we were about the future for our nation.
No, I agree. I agree. For have taught in the district for many years. It was a really really great gesture. What I want to do, because we're limited on time here, and there's some really great questions in here. I think this question is something that doesn't get addressed very often, and it sits in the chat, and it asks, can you touch on CRT and its application to Jews, Native Americans, and other groups? Because we do hear a lot about African Americans, we're not hearing about the other groups as well.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, when I was preparing for this presentation, I did look at other racial and ethnic perspectives. And there's many of the Native American groups who absolutely have signed on with CRT, because what that allows us again to do is to incorporate everyone's histories, right? We're aware of the level of anti-Semitism in this country, and it's very, very concerning. And what we're wanting to do and needing to do is also bring forth some more of those stories, those contributors. The Scottsboro case down in Alabama in the 1930s. For those who are into really into legal theories, Powell v. Alabama, which now gives us our rights to at the federal level to counsel in a capital murder case. What a lot of people don't know is that he was actually represented by a Jewish attorney from the East Coast who went down south to represent them, because the lawyers down south were not wanting to represent them, even because at that time there was nothing that said about indigent defense when someone was accused of a capital murder crime. But again, when we tell these whole stories, because like when I first heard this story about the Scottsboro boys, it was, of course, it was an absolutely deplorable story, but we didn't get everybody's story. That was something that I learned, was the contributions of greater people when I got older and started not only reading more about it, but also teaching it and being able to incorporate, because that was a major part of the story, was the ethnicity of the attorney. But when we're leaving these stories out, critical race theory is not about just being African American or Latinx or Latino or Latina. It's about including everyone who had a contribution to this country, and that includes Native Americans, and it includes Jewish people. It includes everyone who built, who helped to bring this country into fruition. I hope that was helpful.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you. There's so much in this chat, and I'm going to say this before we kind of take one more last final question. And I didn't ask your permission for this, but your contact information is up there.
This is.
So the questions that we get to, if you all could forward those questions to Dr. Kenya Young, I'm sure that we can get those answered. And I thank all of you for wanting to get this out. So let's see if we can get one more in. Ramona, do you have one more question before we wrap up?
Well, I just think that this is one that is very important. There is a participant who asked about where they can find this recording because they think that it's very important to be able to take this recording and share this with groups who may or may not share the same point of view that was presented today, but for more of an informational purposes. And they gave some very good suggestions about where we should make sure that this is shared. So where will it be posted and when do we think it will be posted?
Well, I'll answer that only because we have posted all 17 of our speaker series on the district website on the equity tab. And as soon as this has downloaded and we're able to post this, I can't say as quick as tomorrow, but it will take place in the next couple of days, and you can go back and look at this. And this is definitely the kind of media that we want you to pay attention to. There's a lot here to dissect, and there's a lot of questions in here that we're not going to be able to get to. But what I do hope tonight is that everyone had a chance to listen and to hear and to provide whatever information you came in with. Maybe it replaced some information that you had previously. You may even have more questions, but maybe put your mind at ease a little bit for those that are maybe a little bit still kind of apprehensive on what this was. I hope that it helped calm a lot of that. I have to admit, when we first met with Dr. Young, right off the bat, we loved how conversational she was, and I think you found that tonight. And I encourage you to continue to try to seek your own journey in finding out what this really is, and hopefully, when you leave this evening, that you will have that. So I'm going to wrap up and leave it to any of my panelists here that would want to say any closing remarks. But thank you all. We had a great group tonight, almost 140, I believe, close to it, that came on. So if anybody else has any closing remarks, now is the time to do that with 2 minutes.
I just want to echo what I'm seeing throughout the chat here as I'm monitoring that Dr. Kenya, everyone is very thankful for the method in which you presented the information. It was very accessible to us all, very easy to process and understand. So thank you very much for taking that time to be here with us tonight.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate you all having me. This has been wonderful. It's been a great experience.
Thank you so much. Everyone have a great night.